Welcome. This is FRN's online IEP Basics class. Before we get started in talking about the IEP process, I want to just give us a couple of reminders. The first is that FRN is a peer-to-peer parent agency. We are located in San Leandro, California, and we serve all of Alameda County. Therefore, the information included in this training is specific to our area and to our state, which is California. I also want to remind everybody that this information should not be taken as legal advice. This is a peer-to-peer parent training. And therefore, if you need legal advice, I would contact an attorney for that legal advice, and that's our suggestion. Today's training is really to give you an overview of what the IEP process is about, to get a better understanding of what you as a parent and your child as a child with special needs is entitled to, and some advocacy tips on how you can work more effectively with your school district. So this is our beginning of IEP Basics, and welcome everybody. So our overview today is to talk about those questions I just discussed. First, what is an IEP, right? It can be very confusing for people. Who is eligible for special education? How does the IEP process itself work? What are special education services? And how can I get my child what they need at school? So these are topics that we're going to be covering today. Just a really basic introduction to give you comfortable understanding of what's going to happen at the IEP process, or a better understanding if you're a veteran. So let's start with what is an IEP, right? It's probably a phrase that you've heard a lot. And people will equate the IEP with the idea of a child being outside of a regular classroom, and we're going to learn that that's not true. An IEP is very simply an individual education plan. The IEP is a document, right? That means it is an agreement between yourself, if you are the parent of a child who is eligible under IDEA, and the school district, as well as a process that's laid out in the law that sets forth the IEP process. And that law is called the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, better known as IDEA. And IDEA is a law that is periodically reauthorized by the American Congress, and the last time that was done is 2004, and that's the version of the law we're going to be talking about today, with the specifics to the state of California. Because as a federal law that is enacted by the state, states can give people more rights than things that are in the general federal law. They can give them less. And so what's available in California, what's legal in California may be a little different from the processes in other states. So if you're watching this and you're from another state, hi, but you're welcome to be here. But some of the things that we might talk about may be specific to California, and I just wanted people to know that again. And then finally, IDEA, that law, is the law that creates the basic entitlement for eligible students with disabilities to receive the needed services at school. So when we're talking about kids with disabilities, for the most part, we're talking about this law, IDEA. And as I said, IDEA creates this IEP process. So what is this IEP process? What is this IEP document that we're talking about? So some of the information in the agreements that are written in an IEP, an individual education plan, can include what a child's special education needs are. That's a very important part of the document. We're going to see as we talk on that the district do an evaluation of the child to determine what the needs are. We're also going to talk about the fact that even though the district does that evaluation, the parents are the experts on their child, and they bring very important information to this process. Second, the IEP can have what a child's goals are for the next year. IEPs generally run for a year at a time, and at each IEP meeting, you write a set of goals that say, what is my child going to be doing in the next year? What are the academic and other related areas in which this child needs to have some specific goals to work on? The third part of an IEP is the services and supports that a child will receive in order to have a reasonable chance of getting to those goals. Because that is in part what the entitlement is under IDEA, that law. It's that a child gets the services they need to have a reasonable chance of achieving their IEP goals. The IEP document should also, under number 4, specify how often and how much services a child should be receiving in this agreement, in this program, and how and when those services are going to be delivered. So the services can be delivered in a whole bunch of different ways. They can be delivered individually, they can be delivered in a group, they can be delivered in a classroom, they can be delivered in a pull-out session, all of which are completely appropriate depending on the child's needs. But the issue here is it should be laid out in the program. So in an IEP program and in the IEP process, what we're deciding is what the child needs, what the goals are they're going to be working for, what the services and supports they're going to be getting to work on those goals and have a good chance of getting to those goals, how often and how much those services are going to be, and then how and where those services are going to be delivered. So we talked a little bit about those services and supports giving a child a reasonable chance of achieving their IEP goals. And so what I want to talk about is this concept, these two very important concepts in the IEP process. And they are the concept of FAPE, F-A-P-E, in LRE, least restrictive environment. So I'm going to define both of these, but this idea, FAPE in LRE, is the basic entitlement of the IEP process. So it's a really important idea. I'm going to take away one super special important thing today from listening to this webinar. This is the one I'd take away, that the basic entitlement of the IEP process is FAPE and LRE, right? So let's talk about the fact that how we decide it and what these things are. So the IEP plan, as we talked about, the program, is decided at a meeting or a set of meetings between the school district staff and a family, right? These can take place over a couple of weeks. Sometimes they're condensed into a few days, but there should be enough time for everybody to be able to collaboratively work together and get what a particular child needs, to fully understand what their needs are, to look at the options for how to support that child and determine a program that is going to give them a reasonable chance, right, to get to their goal. And the entitlement under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, that law that we talked about a couple of slides back, IDEA, is for that FAPE, that free and appropriate public education, right, in what we call the least restrictive environment. So these two concepts are really essential to the concept of the IEP process and to the concept of IDEA. So let's back up a little bit and look at just the concept of FAPE. FAPE means that a child receives a program that is individualized to that specific child's needs and designed to meet their unique needs, right? So those are really important things. A program that is individualized to a specific child. This is what makes special education special. For other kids, for our neurotypical kids, for our normally developing kids, for kids that don't have these kinds of challenges and are not eligible under IDEA, we have programs that we're going to fit them into. For a child in IDEA, a program is supposed to be individualized to the child. The child is not supposed to fit the program is supposed to fit that child, and it's supposed to meet their unique needs. The second part of this definition that you should pay attention to is that it provides access to the general curriculum, and the third is that it provides educational benefit. So this idea of educational benefit is one of the harder things for people to wrap their head around when they're thinking about this concept of a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. And educational benefit, some educational benefit, used to be defined as making non-trivial progress on your IEP goals, right? And that was normally what people were looking for, that you were making progress on your IEP goals that was not trivial or too small. And if this sounds vague to you, that's because it intentionally is left that way, right? That this is the way the law has been written. This is even though there have been opportunities to clarify it, it really hasn't been clarified. The best clarification came a couple of years ago in a lawsuit, right? Because a lot of this comes from the Supreme Court. And that lawsuit, this is pretty much a quote from it, says that to meet its substantive education obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP, right? The things we've been talking about, reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstance. So there's a lot of important things packed into this one little sentence. Reasonably calculated. That means it's our best guess, right? From our experience with our child, from our knowledge of the field, from our experience with other kids, that what we're giving this child is going to enable them to make progress. And that progress should be appropriate in light of their child's circumstance. And that's the second really important part of this definition. And it's so important because a lot of times when kids have special needs, we don't have high expectations of them, right? And so that the goals we're talking about making progress on are maybe not as ambitious as they should be. And what the Supreme Court very clearly said is you should think about what a child's capabilities and circumstances are, and what your obligation under this law called IDEA is to give the child this program that is going to give them a reasonable chance, right, to make progress on appropriate goals for them. And that's a really important idea of FAPE, right? So it's free and appropriate, right? It means it's no cost to a parent, no cost to a family. Appropriate means it's reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress, right? In light of their circumstances, that's the public education part, that they get the public education that they need. The second part of that basic entitlement, you remember, was FAPE and LRE, right? And LRE stands for Least Restrictive Environment. And it's important for families to know that IDEA calls for children to be placed in their least restrictive environment. And as with all things in the IEP process, LRE depends on the child and their needs, right? So there is not a single LRE that you can say, ooh, this is LRE. There is a predisposition, in my understanding as a non-attorney advocate, there's a predisposition in the law that this means the classroom that a child would have otherwise been in if they didn't have a disability. That's like the first choice if it's possible, but it's not going to fit everybody. So where your least restrictive environment is really going to depend on who you are as a child, as a person, as a learner, right? So LRE may be the class that I just spoke about that you would have otherwise gone to if you didn't have a disability. So it can be a child in a general education class, and they might be getting supports and services in that class. They might have an aide in that class who works with them part of time. They might be seated in the front of the class as an accommodation. They might be receiving assignments that are broken down further than maybe the assignments other kids are getting. They might be getting some assistance from a resource teacher to help to firm up some of the ideas that are otherwise difficult for them to understand. Again, it depends on the child's needs, right? But it's really important for you as a parent to remember that those needs and those services, those supports, should always be listed explicitly in anything you agree to in the IEP process, right? So we're going to talk about this idea of FAPE and LRE. We're going to talk about the IEP process. But it's important for you to understand that this is going to be a journey for you as a parent, right? This is going to be something where you're learning as you go along. So the first thing that I always say to people is forgive yourself as a learner. Give yourself some time to start reading and understanding the material. And this hopefully is a good first start for you for understanding the IEP. But as I said, if you're going to take one thing away today, it should be that idea of FAPE and LRE, a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, which is the basic entitlement that kids should be receiving under IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. Okay? So we're going to move on to our second question, which is, who is eligible for special education? So to be eligible for special education under IDEA, a child must fit into, in California law, one of 14 categories. And I have all the categories listed out there. And you can see that there are a lot of different categories. Most of the kids, are under specific learning disability. That's one of the more popular ones in terms of the number of kids who fit it. We have all kinds of different issues here, and a child must fit under the standards for one of those in order to be eligible under IDEA. But in addition to fitting into one of those categories, a child must, or a student must, require and not merely benefit from special education services. That means specially designed instruction. In other words, if you are a person who has a disability and you fit into one of those categories, if you don't require special education, right, then you don't receive it. And by requiring special education, what I'm talking about is a judgment of the team of people who get together in the IEP process to say, well, does this person require special education, right? And if they do, and they fit a category, then they're found eligible under IDEA. In some cases, people might have the disability but not fit the eligibility part of requiring special education, right? Or in some cases, kids are evaluated and districts find that they don't fit into one of the categories, then that their issues may be not severe enough to be able to be eligible under IDEA. So all those things can happen when a child gets evaluated. So let's talk about that process that I started alluding to of how a child gets evaluated and how the IEP process itself works, right? Because that's an important thing for us as parents to understand. So I have this great, very important little design. It's from one of our SELPAs here, which is the North Region Special Education Plan. And SELPAs are groups of districts form a SELPA in most cases. So North Region SELPA is Albany, Alameda, Berkeley, Emeryville, and Piedmont in Alameda County. And the SELPA is responsible for the delivery of special education. In other places, the districts are so large, like for Oakland is its own SELPA. There's not a separate organization. But the SELPA is a great place to get information or to participate in decision-making on the IEP process. So we're going to go in more detail, but I thought this was a great chart. It's a little overwhelming at first, but I think if you read it, it really helps to understand that how the IEP process starts this with a written referral, right? We're going to go over and over again in talking today, and anytime you would talk to anybody at FRN, they'll tell you if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So we always start with a written referral. And a written referral just means a request to have your child evaluated. And usually the phrase we use, in all areas of suspected disability. So evaluated in all areas of suspected disability. And then usually we ask the parents to write out what specifically they're concerned about so that the school district has an idea of what their child needs to be evaluated in. But the districts also have experience with the children, so they should also have a good understanding and idea of what the child should be evaluated in. But the evaluation should be covering all areas in which the child may have a disability. So the district receives this written request, right? Then they have 15 calendar days to develop an assessment plan, right? And give it to the parents. The parents then have 15 calendar days to look over this assessment plan, and the assessment plan basically tells you the areas in which a child is going to be evaluated, a child or a youth. So very typically we have kids that, young kids who are going to be evaluated in speech, right? Parents look that over, they sign it, they return it to the school district, right? And then the school district has 60 calendar days to conduct an assessment, to have an IEP meeting, to propose a plan that meets that FAPE and LRE requirement of IDEA. And the parent, none of the services will start until the parent consents. Now this is a simplified view because if I was making this chart, I'd probably be putting a lot of circles in the bottom where parents are not agreeing and there's advocacy that's taking place, but as a simplified view of kind of how the IEP process works, this is pretty good. You write and you request your child gets evaluated. In about a little more than 2 weeks, they're going to send you an assessment plan. You sign it and send it back. They have an evaluation. They have a meeting. They determine whether a child is eligible. They develop an IEP, and if the parent agrees, they consent, right? And that's how the process works. The other important part to look at here is that most IEPs are reviewed in a year. So you can see that there's a 1 year or more frequently if district and parent agree, right? Review for an IEP process, and there's a 3-year reevaluation for a child. That's usually called the triennium. So this is just a nice little chart for your interest to have. Again, this is specific to California, but I like it because it has the timelines on it and it has some of the parent rights on it. So I like to put it up front for people, those 15 days to get you a proposed assessment plan from the date of your referral, 15 days for parents to sign the assessment plan, right? IEP notification early enough to ensure an opportunity to attend, right? So that means if you can't attend, if it's at an inconvenient time, if you're traveling for work, if you can't get the day off, if you've got other kids and you can't get childcare, ask for a different day, right? I always say to try to be as professional and kind to the people you're working with as possible, and telling them at the earliest, your earliest possible date that something's inconvenient for you. But it's always really important for you to participate if you can, and to make sure that the district is aware, right, of any issues that you have, any time constraints that you have. But just because they call a meeting doesn't mean that that's the time you have a meeting, and that's a really important thing for people to know. Then the team, once all that's done, has our 60 days in which to have the evaluations and develop the IEP. And then once the IEP is signed, and it's a little funky here because it doesn't say that, the IEP implementation is only after a parent has signed it, right? Generally, the district cannot evaluate, as far as I know, as a non-attorney parent advocate. District can only implement services if, right, they have a parent signature, okay? Then there's 30 days if you want to revisit the IEP. If you have something else you want to talk about, then the district has to have an IEP meeting for you. At least annually, the district is supposed to have the 1-year review, and then every 3 years they have the reassessment. So these are things just to think about as we think about this process, right? So let's pull out, this is all overwhelming, I know, for people, especially if it's your first time. Let's pull out the little pieces and start with the referral for evaluation. Okay, so we all know, right, that the school district is obligated under law to identify and serve children with eligible disabilities under IDEA. This is something called their child find obligation, right? This means sometimes the district can contact a parent to initiate evaluation for a disability, but more commonly a parent writes a letter to the district asking for their child to be evaluated in all areas of suspected disability. Okay, so this is really important if you have a concern to put it in writing. Don't put it in writing to the teacher or the principal. We always recommend that people put it in writing to the special ed director of their school district, to the program specialist working with their school, but somebody outside of the site, right? Because you really want to have a child evaluated, and when they get that evaluation, that request for evaluation, that starts those timelines we were just looking at. So generally, we don't want to hand this to our teacher or our principal. Generally, we want to hand this to our school district, and what we usually recommend is printing 2 copies, right? Bring one in, telling the secretary to take one and to sign the other for you. And that way you get an idea and a receipt, right, of when you handed in that written request for assessment. And that helps you in having to know when the timeline should be taking place. So that's an easy way to document when you've requested assessment and to make sure it gets to the people who can start the assessment process. Once they've gotten that, as we talked about, they send you back an assessment plan, which indicates the areas in which the child's skills will be evaluated. This is why in that letter requesting assessment, assessment, we tell people, tell them everything, right? I know as parents, as a parent myself, it's hard to say, here are areas where my child is lacking, or where my child has fallen behind, or where my child may not have the skills that other kids do. But if you don't let them know, right, they might not assess in those areas. So we really want to make sure we are as thorough as possible in telling people these are all the areas we want our child to assess. And then after sending you back that plan, you sign it and the district receives that signed assessment plan back. Then the district has 60 days to conduct the assessment and hold the IEP meeting. So thinking about the evaluation, some of these things we've talked a little about already. First, you want to make sure that the assessment is in all areas of suspected disability. You want to make sure you disclose all your concerns, right, as we just talked about. This is particularly important when you're talking about the little guys who are not yet enrolled in school because the districts don't know them as well. I think those are times that it's hard for parents, because many parents don't realize that IDEA, the part that we're talking about here, which is Part B of IDEA, covers kids from 3 to 21. And so sometimes they think their kids are too young for help, but they're not. So the school district covers those kids 3 to 21, and California Early Start covers the kids 0 to 3. So kids of any age that have challenges with their development, with their education, with their access to this, may be able to get help if they're eligible under these laws, right? So we want to make sure that we get them enrolled. But if they're young and not known to these, the district or to the agency that's evaluating them, we want to make sure we give them as much information as possible. The other thing that we tell parents is that when they sign that assessment plan and prepare to send it back, it's a really good idea to ask for the reports, to pin up a little letter on there and say, can you get me the reports in advance of the IEP meeting? Because I like to prepare questions and talk about what's confusing or I might think is incorrect. And so that's a good habit to get into, is when you send in the assessment plan, to ask for those to be given to you in about a week in advance at best, right? So that you can read through, get an idea of what's going on, and see whether you agree or disagree with what's in the assessment. So as I said, once we've had this evaluation, we're going to get together the IEP team, usually in about 60 days of the receipt of a signed assessment plan, right? And IDEA really does specify which people should be there, and this is important for families to know. And the reason that you have all these people on the IEP team, because I know a lot of times families would like a smaller team because all these people can seem intimidating, right? But you have an administrator. Why do we have an administrator? And they're often called the administrative designee if they're getting fancy on the paperwork. That's a person who's knowledgeable about the resources of the district, right? And that's important. We have a general education teacher, and this is if the child is to be included in a regular classroom at all, right? That's an important person to have there. A special education teacher who can help to design the program that we're talking about with this child in collaboration with the rest of the team. Therapists or specialists who can interpret the results of evaluations, and others with specialized knowledge of the child. And a translator, if the parent's primary language is not English, right? So the parent or youth should be there, right, as well. That's a long discussion about when the child is old enough. I always think it's the parent's call, right? And different parents have different calls depending on their parenting style and their culture and what their child is like, or whether they have the child attend the meeting. But once a child is 18, their education rights go back to them. So it's important things for parents to think about, but only the parent or the youth can excuse members from attending the IEP meeting. And I want to make sure parents get a hold of that particular point, because a lot of the times we'll have what's called team atrophy. We have lots of people leaving before we've finished all the discussion, and they'll ask you to sign a piece of paper that says this is okay. And the honest answer is you don't have to sign it. You can have another meeting. But if you're having an IEP meeting, all the required members should be at the meeting, because otherwise it's really hard to have a meaningful discussion about your child. And that's usually what I say. I'd love to let you go, right? But I need you or this one or the speech pathologist or the OT or whoever it happens to be there to have a meaningful discussion about my child, and in order to craft a good IEP. So it's a right that you have, that you don't have to excuse members. So they should be leading when you come in. If somebody says they have another meeting, then you shouldn't be having another an IEP meeting at this time. And you can tell them that you can just you just want to reschedule at a time when everyone can be there for the whole discussion. So at this IEP meeting, the IEP team members discuss the student's needs. They review the assessments. They determine whether first the child is eligible under IDEA. They determine that at the initial IEP, and they determine that every 3 years at the triennial, right? The other thing the team proposes is a plan that is individual to the student or child's needs, which means that we have to establish what all the needs are, talk about goals that are appropriate to meet those needs, and then talk about the services and supports that are going to help us get to those goals. So I always call what I just described the basic rules of the IEP process. What I described so far is kind of the official process, right? Who meets when does the paperwork come in, when's this due, who has to be at the meeting, what's the process, right? But I want to talk a little bit more before I talk about how IEP can end, is about what I call the basic rules, right? And I call these the basic rules because people tend to only pay attention. Parents tend to only pay attention, particularly when they're new to the IEP process, to what the district is offering in terms of placements. And what we're really talking about here is which of these things drive each other, right? So those evaluations and assessments that people hear, and that can be very painful to listen to because they often have negative information about your child, and they stress what your child can't do, right? So people often just turn off and don't really want to listen. Those really establish your child's needs. They are vital to this process. So I really want you to ask a lot of questions there. I really want you to pay attention to it. I really want you to make comments if they're inaccurate or wrong, right? If things are missing or things that are there shouldn't be there, right? Because this evaluation, this assessment is going to establish what your child's needs are, and that's essential to the rest of the process. Then the goals build upon that, and they establish reasonable expectations in the areas where your child needs help of what your child should be expected to do, what should your child be expected to progress in the next year. So say we're talking about a preschooler, right? We might be talking about counting to 10 in the next year, right? And that might be something that is an appropriate goal for that child. But if that child learned how to count to 10 in a week and has already in the week past learned to count to 20, then that's not going to be an appropriate goal. And if the goal is too low, you're not going to get the supports and services that you need. So you want to have reasonable expectations for the child. Well, not ones that are too low so that they don't really have to do any work and then the child will meet the goals anyway. Not ones that are so high that the child's self-esteem will be damaged by never, ever being able to reach them, right? You want something that's kind of in between. The just right goals is what I would call them. So you want to pay attention to those goals. You want to ask about them. You want to say, what does this mean? What are other children this age doing? You want to get an idea of where your child is vis-a-vis their peers. And you want to think about what's reasonable for them. And you as the parent are the holder of the child's history. So your input is really vital to the goals as well as to the evaluation and assessment. And then finally, placement flows from the first two, right? And by placement, I mean the supports and services that are offered in an IEP, the classroom that a child's going to be in, the services that they're going to get, the accommodations and modifications that they're going to get are all dependent on the goals. They're supposed to get enough so that they have a reasonable chance of achieving those goals. So how do they make this decision in the IEP process? Well, you go to an IEP meeting. The team presents their evaluations and assessments. They suggest the goals. And then the district makes what we call an offer of FAPE, right? An offer of a free and appropriate public education. So we're going back to that beginning part, right? That's what they're supposed to be getting with these evaluations and these goals. We're supposed to be getting to the place where placement is FAPE and LRE, right? And as a parent, you're going to have the ability to negotiate with the district at that point in time, to figure out and ask them what alternatives they have to offer. Their responsibility is to make an offer of a placement that offers you FAPE and LRE, right? After going through the process, as we talked a little bit about today. So goals, just to review quickly, right? You should spend a lot of time thinking about your IEP goals. We talked about the idea that parent expertise really matters here. A lot of people use SMART, measurable goals, right? That relate both to the curriculum as well as the student's needs. And we already talked about the goal should be an appropriate level to allow for progress, but not too high to, be damaging to the child or be impossible to reach, right? And then we talked about the idea of placement being that which gives the child a reasonable chance of achieving their goals. So placement, the idea of placement, offers all the supports and services, such as if you have an inclusion specialist helping if a child's in a general ed classroom, speech therapy, assistive technology, everything the child is getting is part of the placement, that offer of FAPE and LRE. And also it should be specified to the duration, type, and frequency. One of the things that we always say to parents is sometimes districts will say, oh, well, we're offering such and such a classroom and we have a speech therapist there to speak, to work on speech with the kids a couple times a week, and we have a occupational therapist to work on writing a couple times a week, and this is what we're offering the child. But they just write down the classroom. And the problem with that kind of offer, well, it's great to have things integrated into the classroom. If the district decided not to offer that classroom the next year with the speech pathologist and the OT, the parent would not have any right to those services under the IEP. So we really always want all services to be specified, right, to their duration, type, and frequency, right? And we also want to have the services specified as to whether the child is in the classroom, right, and somebody comes in to work with them, or whether a therapist might bring a child outside of the classroom. That's all part of the placement discussions when we're designing FAPE and LRE for any particular kid. So I always like to stress here that the school district has that responsibility for proposing the plan to meet the individual needs of the child, right? And I like the I as an IEP because it is individual, right? So if a discussion in an IEP starts with, we have this great program that we think, matches your child exactly, I always worry, right? Because it is supposed to be individualized. And it might be that that great program matches your child individually, but you really want to make sure it does in the discussion. So the family and the school should work together on the plan because parents are the experts on their children, right? And so you bring, as a parent, a tremendous amount of information, a tremendous amount of experience with this child into the process. And I also always say you also have a lot of power in the process, because if you do not agree to the IEP, you do not, and we're going to talk more about this later, you do not have to sign it. If you do not sign it, the district cannot implement it unless you sign it, or they bring you to hearing and win, right? They bring you to a due process hearing and win. And if you have a prior IEP, if this is not your first IEP, your old IEP stays in effect until a new one is signed. I particularly want people who the district comes and says, well, we've decided to stop speech therapy for your child. And it might be that your response to that is, yay, great, my child no longer needs speech therapy, and you don't want them to have it, and it's wonderful, right? And that might be perfect. However, right, it also might be that you don't think that this is the right thing. And the district can actually not end that unless you sign the IEP agreeing that the service is going to stop, right? If you do not agree that the service is going to stop, the district has to go to hearing and win in order to stop that service, right? So this partnership is one of the district having a lot of power and education and knowledge in thinking about the program and proposing what they think is right, and having the ability to meet your child's needs. And the family has a lot of expertise and power in agreeing with what having the ability to agree or disagree with what the district proposes, and being able to advocate for their kids to get what they need. So this kind of partnership, to me, is one of the most effective ways to approach the process, that it's not, one side or the other has all the power, but that the two sides have a lot of power, and together they can design what's right for an individual child. Okay, so we've talked about the IEP, we've talked about who's eligible, we've talked about how the process works. Now let's talk a little bit about those kind of services that I was talking about in the placement portion. When we're talking about placement, what are we talking about for special education services, right? So special ed is education targeted to eligible children who require services and supports to make progress at school, right? Simple definition. Altogether, they are part of placement or the offer of faith, and usually there are at least three different parts, right? There's a classroom, there's services and supports, and there's accommodations and modifications. So we're going to talk about a little about each of those three. So what kind of classroom? So in an IEP, the kind of classroom is usually specified. Districts have all different kinds of names for their classrooms, and so this might not match exactly what your district tells you. So you really want to talk to them if they say it's a speech-enriched classroom or it's a mild to moderate classroom. You want to say exactly what does that mean. But generally there are three types of classrooms, three broad classifications of classrooms. There's what we call the regular classroom, or the classroom where neurotypical kids are, which is we call general ed or GE class. There are resource classrooms, which are sometimes called RSP, right? They can also be called learning disabled classroom, a cumulatively impaired classroom, the reading specialty classroom. It's usually just a class in which they are working on academic skills, right? A special day class, and this is where we get the ideas of things from mild to moderate or severely handicapped or multi-handicapped classes. And they all have different advantages or different disadvantages depending on your child. Want to go for what individually meets their need rather than say, oh, my child should be in this kind of classroom, right? The services and supports, right, can be called related services or designated instructional services, so that's fallen out of favor a bit. Are services needed to help your child to achieve their IEP goals, right? There are a large variety of services, but it is important to know that you don't have to qualify for a specific service, right? So if you qualify under autism, like behavior, that doesn't mean you have to qualify individually for speech. When you qualify under IDEA, when you're eligible under IDEA, you're supposed to get any services and supports you need to have a reasonable chance of achieving your goal, right? The second thing is you have to require those services. They can't be something that's just beneficial or helpful. They have to be something that is necessary for your child in order to benefit, in order to make progress, right? And then it's always important to know for a child to have their entitlement to receive a specific service, they need to be listed specifically and explicitly on the IEP. So what are examples of the kind of services and support a child can get? Speech and language to support language development, physical or occupational therapy to help with walking or handwriting or sensory issues, behavioral services to help a child to access learning, transportation for your child between home school or home and day child care, right? Those are all important. Paraprofessional support for a child to help with personal needs or with behavior. These are examples. This is not an extensive list. This is just kind of some examples to give you an idea of the sorts of things that can be services and supports for a child. One that I always like to highlight, because not that many people are familiar with it, is assisted technology. And those are any kind of items that are used to help the child access the curriculum. This can be everything from high-tech items like computers with specialized software to low-tech items like pencil grips. And that is something that not everybody thinks to ask about or to discuss in the IEP. So I always like to put it there because there's a lot of technology that can help kids learn. And again, AT needs to be necessary and not merely beneficial to a child. Counseling or therapy is another example to work on social emotional issues like anxiety. This is another example of the kinds of things that can be in services and supports for a kid. So we have our placement, we have our kind of classroom, we have our GE classrooms, our RSP classrooms, and our special day classrooms. And we have the services and supports that we have for a child, which are all different types. And we gave some examples like assisted tech or transportation. Then we have this idea of, do we have accommodations or modifications for a child? And I always want to stress this for people because this is another page that people just don't usually look at. But it can make a difference, especially when we have a child who's going toward a high school diploma. So accommodations, right, do not fundamentally alter or lower expectations of the standards of the curriculum, right? And that's really important. Modifications, on the other hand, do lower the standards of the curriculum, right? So if you have somebody who's sitting in an algebra class and is doing the algebra with the other kids, but is doing maybe half the problems because they have a slower processing speed and the teacher has picked out a representative set of problems, that child is largely probably getting an accommodation, right? They have not changed the difficulty of the work, right, or the performance. If, however, the child in the classroom is there for to be able to be in a regular ed setting and is doing, instead of the algebra problems, maybe 4th or 5th grade math, then that is a place where there has been modification. And it did fundamentally change or lower the expectations. Accommodations provide access and equal opportunity to determine what is learned. A lot of times when you're talking about accommodations, you're talking about what we call universal learning design, and some of our districts are very big on that, and giving people different ways, writing, video, speaking, to share what they know, right? Modifications provide learning experiences that are based on individual needs and abilities. They don't keep you usually with the curriculum, though you know, a modified curriculum can be a really good and strong one if it's focused on your own needs, right? The grading and credit is the same as for typical students for an accommodation, but for a modification, that will differ. Okay, so our special education services, when we're talking about that placement of what FAIT consists of, it consists of a placement in the classroom, those services that we gave examples of, in accommodations and modifications for the child in order for them to be able to participate fully in the curriculum, right? So the last question we want to talk about in today's short training is, how can I help my child get what they need in school, right? So we're going to start with some general suggestions. The first is to keep an open mind and listen to what the school district suggests. And I know that some people are not trusting of the school districts and they worry about that. But I always say that the first place to start is to listen to the suggestions, right? If they're good suggestions, you might want to try them. If they're not good suggestions, listening well to what they suggest gives you more information about how you want to argue for something different, right? Make sure your voice is heard, as you know your child best. You are the expert on your child, and that's a really important thing to always remember. Come to the meeting prepared to ask lots and lots of questions. People have a right to understand this. It's called the right of informed consent. And sometimes people who do this all day for a living, staff at schools, do this all day for a living, they are not as patient with parents as they should be, and they want to sometimes rush through things. But it's really important to remember that you have that right to understand, right? And if they try to rush you, or somebody rolls their eyes at you when you ask a question, or somebody starts tapping their watch, or looking around, or checking their phone, remember, you have that right to informed consent. And you can say, I don't really feel like I have informed consent at this point in time. And ask your questions, right? Which is why you want to get your evaluations early. So you can spend more time asking questions and less time listening to them read. In fact, for a lot of times, if I've had the evaluations and I've gone through them, and the parents have done that as well, they just ask questions and ask the therapist to summarize and waive the reading of the evaluations, right? In some cases, our parents have difficulty with English literacy, then reading might be a great thing. But in cases where you've already gone through it, this is a great option to have, is to just move on and to focus on your questions and what you're concerned about, as opposed to just focusing on reading through a document. It also allows the meeting to focus more on the interaction between the school district and the parent, and less on just the reading of what the school district's evaluations say. You can bring someone with you to an IEP meeting. That's really important to know. I often would bring somebody to take notes for me, right? You know, in difficult situations, I would bring one of my other friends who is an advocate to help me to advocate for my child. And only you can decide of your supporters who should be at the meeting, right? That's not a general question that's open to everybody, right? So you have the right to invite anybody who has specialized knowledge of your kid, right? So that's your ability. As I said, getting the evaluations and the assessments can help to make the meeting more focused, so that's a good thing to do. The other thing that I often tell families to do is to write their own family agenda and give it to the district of things that you want to discuss at the meeting. Sending out a family agenda a week in advance can help ensure that, especially if you're shy or have difficulty finding a place to insert into the meeting, it can really focus the district on the things that you want to talk about and what your concerns are. If there's resistance to your agenda, if the district people say, oh, we can't get to this today, then say, fine, we'll just have to have another second meeting, right? So let's get out our calendars and plan that second meeting, because I have a right of meaningful parental participation in the process, okay? So these are two really important rights that parents have: the informed consent, which we just talked about, and the ability to participate in the formation of the IEP, which is called meaningful parental participation. And if they try to cut your points out and not discuss things you're interested in, that's what I'd say. I'm not feeling like I'm having meaningful parental participation. One of the other things that anybody here will tell you is everything has to be in writing. Nothing exists unless it is, right? So always communicate with the school in writing. If it doesn't, you know, if there is no record of it, then nobody knows if it really happened. So you should write back to school. You should also have a huge box. I always find when Target or Walmart is having those sales around, you know, around the holidays or around back to school, and I buy those cheap plastic boxes. I mark it with the year, and I put every piece of paper I have, and I make sure that every discussion I have is on a piece of paper, right? You can also ask for written copies of rules or policies if something is not clear, right? If people say something like, we don't do that, you know, one that we hear a lot is, we don't let people visit the classrooms. We don't let you look at the classrooms to see if the other classes that we might offer your child look like. Ask for a policy on this. If there's not a policy, right, you know, policies have to be in line with regulations. Regulations have to be in line with laws, right? So a school policy is, first, most of the time there's not even a policy, but then often, even if a policy is there and it's not one that works for you or your family, sometimes you'll find the policies don't match the regulations, and you can ask to oversee that. But most of the time, when you get, we don't do that, and you ask for the policy, there is no policy, right? Another good piece of advice is to read over any notes that were taken at the meeting by any school district personnel, and make sure you agree with them before leaving the meeting. That's always a good way to make sure that the record is clear. We always tell people that they have the right to record the meeting in advance, but you need to let the district know a day in advance. I'm sorry that the picture on this has kind of got in the middle of this, but you just have to let the district know one business day in advance. This means you can listen to the meeting again before deciding to sign. You can also let the team know at the beginning of the meeting that you don't plan to sign any new IEP today, that you're going to bring it home and read it over. The district can ask you to sign for attendance, and you can just sign that. You can also sign any part of the IEP and reject the rest of it, right? We have people, for example, who for the first time learned the district believed their child had a cognitive impairment. They didn't agree, and they agreed to the services, supports, and the goals, but they didn't agree to the eligibility category. They're right next to their name. I don't agree with the eligibility category, but I'm going to take all the goals, services, and support. And that's something that you can do here in California. You can agree with parts of an IEP, and right next to your signature, the things that you don't agree with are the things that still have to be resolved. So that's a great advantage we have here. So what I always say to people is emotion, though it is an important part of life, is not what the IEP meeting is about, right? That it is important to persuade the team using your head with research, data, knowledge of your child's assessments, as well as your heart about what your child requires, right, in order to be successful. So the IEP process, while it might seem overwhelming, is really one that has a lot of rights for parents. And if you make the effort to understand it and to ask the school district to explain things to you and to be professional and persistent in asking for the things your child needs, we find so many people can become really powerful advocates. And parents are the first and best advocates for their child. So I want to congratulate those of you who got to the end of today's training for being the first and best advocates for your child and learning a little bit more about the IEP process. But today was just an introduction. So if you need more, we have other trainings. We actually have some IEP mentor classes and other things that will help you get more information. You are also welcome to drop in. We serve Alameda County families who call or drop in for support. We can also refer you to other agencies that do this work. As I said, we are located in San Leandro, California, and that is our phone number. And we have drop-in support on Monday through Thursday, as well as phone-in support. So you're welcome to call with your questions, and we'll do what we can to help you, or we'll send you in the direction of someone who can. So again, thank you for joining us today for this short webinar on the IEP process. And hopefully you learned some things to help you become a better advocate for your child.